Welcome to Italics, television for the Italian-American experience. I'm your host, Anthony Tamburri. March is Women's History Month, a time in which we reflect upon the advances made by and for women and remind ourselves that women still are not fully emancipated in our society. As women's rights are again increasingly under attack, their access to facilities that aid in their autonomy and well-being rapidly closing down across the country, this episode of Italics is dedicated to honoring the struggle of women and celebrating those in our community who have expressed, through their art and their activism, the stories of women and the need for liberation. We will talk with two icons of Italian poetry and literature, champions of social justice and advocates of the emancipation of women. Poet and activist Danela Gioseffi joins us here in our studio to talk about her latest book, Pioneering Italian-American Culture, Escaping la Vita della Cucina. We will also talk about forging into the mainstream in the 60s and 70s as a woman with an Italian-American name, and breaking the silence for Italian-American women. Correspondent Lucia Grillo takes us to Hastings-on-Hudson for a visit with seminal feminist author Helen Barolini to talk about her most widely known influential works, the novel Umbertina and the Dream Book, how they paved the way for marginalized voices and still hold up today, reflecting the urgent need for such voices, now more than ever. From civil rights worker and journalist in Selma, Alabama, during the era of the Freedom Riders, with written works that span theater, poetry, and books such as Women on War, the first book of world literature to gather the global voices of women on the issues of war and its impact on their lives, an icon of our community and the world beyond. Joining us in our studio is Daniela Gioseffi. Daniela, welcome to Italics.
I'm so pleased to be with you.
Good. Let's start from the beginning.
Okay.
You were a freedom rider. Here's this young Italian-American woman who decides that she's got to get involved and has to do something about what was going on in the early 60s. It was a hard experience for you.
Yes, it was. I was an intern journalist at WSLA-TV. I was only 20 years old, and because of my Italian father, I was still quite innocent and virginal, and I went down south to learn to be the next Faye Emerson, the next great spokeswoman on TV, which was my dream at that time. And I was naive in a way. I had been in school in Newark with African-American students, so it wasn't strange to me to live in an integrated world. But I integrated Deep South television in a day when it wasn't done. I went on an all-black gospel show announcing freedom rides and sit-ins. The next morning, there was a burning cross on the lawn. There were watermelons thrown at the station, and I was taken to the jail in the middle of the night and abused when no one was looking by an assistant sheriff of Montgomery County. What I didn't realize at the time is there was no law. It wasn't like you could call the police. The police were the Klan. And so I got myself in quite a deep amount of trouble. But I never told my Italian father. He would have had a heart attack. So I kept that a secret, my abuse by the Klan a secret, until I was over 50, and I wrote The Bleeding Mimosa, the story of that experience, a fiction based on the story.
You mentioned your Italian father, and you talk about your father in your works, and in fact there's one poem which actually talks about his sort of, we might say, progressive thinking, you know? And I wonder how much he influenced you as far as being someone to look out for others.
Well, he had such a tenacious spirit, and he had worked so hard to become what he was. He was one of the first Italian immigrants to win a Phi Beta Kappa in the liberal arts and a Sigma Psi in the sciences, and he worked his way through Union College and then Columbia University to become a chemical engineer and an inventor. He was extremely compassionate and understanding, and yet he said to me, "Why does a girl want to go to college? You're only going to get married and have babies," when I wanted to go to school. So I had to work my way through Montclair State University, checking hats, working in a drugstore, babysitting, all kinds of odd jobs. And in the end, he was always saying to me, if only, he had 3 daughters, and he would say, if only I had a son to carry on the name. He was so proud of being an Italian. And but then, when I finally did begin publishing, he said, "You're as good as any son." So we had closure. He said, "You put my name in the Library of Congress."
Exactly.
He was so proud of that. And yet he was my inspiration, because he was the one who read to me great literature when I was young. Dante, Shakespeare, Cervantes. He was reading to me when I was only 10. And so on the one hand, he inspired me, but on the other hand, it was a bit of a double bind.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure a lot that double bind, I'm sure, is common with a lot of not just Italian Americans, but other immigrant children, I suspect.
Yes, and even someone has written an essay. I think it was Marianne Menino, saying that women of my generation were more inspired by their fathers to be something in the world and to go out and have a career more than their mothers. All my aunts, my Italian aunts, my mother, they were all seamstresses in factories doing piecework, which I thought was P-E-A-C-E when I was a little girl, but it was not. It was P-I-E-C-E.
Yeah.
And so my only example of someone who made his way in the world was my father, and so his desire to have a son to carry on the name was a great inspiration to me.
And when did you start writing?
Oh, I was writing from a very young age. I was reading Shakespeare, Edna St. Vincent Millay, and Walt Whitman when I was in my teens. And I started writing a diary and writing poetry in my early teens, I would say, since I was 11, 12, 13. And then I began publishing during the new wave of feminism in the 60s. And at that time, I was the only Italian female name in any of those feminist books of the new wave of feminism, along with Diane DePrima on the West Coast. We were the only names you could find in those big anthologies of feminist poetry and literature during the 60s and 70s.
And your first book was a book of poetry, and then you followed soon thereafter with a novel, correct?
Yes, I did Eggs in the Lake, which was very much about being a feminist.
We have two books with us, so we'll talk about the books a little bit. Because if somebody wants to get an idea of a sort of trajectory of your writing and your thinking throughout your career thus far, they can pick up Pioneering Italian American Culture. Why don't you talk to us a little bit about this book and really how it came about, too, because it's not just your book. It is your book in the sense of most of your writings are in there, but someone decided to pay you homage.
Well, Angelina Oberdan, it was her inspiration to put together all the essays I had written, the reviews I had written of other Italian-American writers, and my experience as an Italian-American woman forging her way into the mainstream of American literature, where I was published through the 60s and 70s before there were any Italian female names besides Diane DePrima in the mainstream.
You are very much, and have been and are very much, a social activist. You're also an editorial activist, I must say, in that sense, in that you really get people moving, and that's really good. And you've done that also in with working with someone like Alfredo De Palchi and the Bordighera Poetry Prize and other projects getting funded.
Yes, it was wonderful when I interested Alfredo De Palchi and the Sonia Raices Foundation to be involved with the Bordighera Prize. It was such a thrill that we've now published, 15 other poets in bilingual editions, which was a wonderful thing. And we've all discovered each other. We truly have a community now. And I was thrilled when you and Fred were putting together From the Margins, and I was able to bring some others to you. I know other people helped as well, of course, but I was thrilled that we were beginning to have a community. And then Ishmael Reed asked me to write an essay about our own burgeoning renaissance in Italian-American literature for his Viking book, Multiculturalism. Right. And I won the American Book Award for being a multicultural pioneer. Actually, my book On Prejudice, A Global Perspective, was one of the first to include the sorrows of the Italian-American and the prejudice against the Italian-American, which has often been neglected.
It's important that we branch out and that we don't stay within our own community. It's important for us, obviously, to work within our community, but it's important that we branch out because in this way, we become part of a national discourse.
Yes.
Whereas I think with all the work that many people who have preceded us did, sometimes they stayed too close to home.
Yes.
And didn't really negotiate the larger discussion, I think, that you have been able to do.
It's very important for us not to stay insular because we want to tell our stories to the world. They're really universal. I feel that when I wrote my book of stories, In Bed with the Exotic Enemy, I was trying to say that prejudice is a universal thing, also with On Prejudice, a global perspective, that there is sexism, racism, homophobia, monoculturalism, and we all need to be proud of our heritage, but at the same time see that we're part of the universal humanity.
Yeah, exactly. What were some of your experiences when you first started to try and publish?
I sort of felt a bit like a tarantella dancer trying to do a classic ballet when I entered the mainstream because the style...
I love that, a tarantella dancer trying to do a classic ballet. That's great.
Because I had so much passion in my poetry, which wasn't really stylish in the age of T.S. Eliot. Actually, Dr. Robertiello wrote a book called The Wasp's Mystique, in which he found that all of his ethnic patients of every background, African American, Jewish American, Italian American, Latino, were having difficulty fashioning themselves into what is the polite Anglo-Saxon style which dominated America. But now there's been a burgeoning of multiculturalism, and we're allowed to show our passions and talk with our hands and be more ethnic than we were allowed to back when I started.
We're talking about poets who have preceded us. I'm still fascinated by the fact that certain poets, and I'll name one, John Chardy, still seems to fall off the radar screen in spite of how important he was within American culture. A couple of decades ago, a book came out about poetry, about American poetry, and he's not in that book, and I thought it was kind of strange.
Because he was the first one to make poetry a household word.
Yeah.
He was the first one to bring it to PBS television. He published in the Saturday Review. He was an important editor. Lawrence Ferlinghetti, too, has published the most popular book ever in the United States, a big best-selling, the most best-selling poetry book, A Coney Island of the Mind.
Right.
It's been in print, it's still in print, it's sold over 1 million copies, and yet Lawrence Ferlinghetti and John Ciardi have never won a Pulitzer or a National Book Award, though they're names that have promoted poetry. The whole Beat generation wouldn't have existed without Ferlinghetti. City Lights Bookstore, the most famous bookstore for literature in the entire world, and the best-selling book, and he's been awarded everything from the French, from the Italians. He's had so many awards, and yet not the American awards of the Pulitzer Prize or the National Book Award or the American Book Award, the major one.
Yeah.
So it's surprising, and I don't know why that is. I remember that Ciardi writes a poem about how his name was mispronounced Ciardi. He wrote about how he was angry when Robert Lowell called him the best Italian-American poet in the country instead of just the best American poet. So it's a mystery why this continues.
I just wanted to let our audience know that there is a documentary in the works that Anton Evangelista is doing on your life, and I'm not sure when it'll be completed, but
I think by September.
Okay, by September of this year. Great.
Yes,
great.
I'm thrilled about that. He's titled it Author and Activist, so that's nice, although I've always had 2 feet, one in the Italian-American community, one in the mainstream, one in activism, and one in literature. So I feel as though I've been striding 2 icebergs that could float apart any minute.
But really, the one in Italian-American culture and the one in American culture is really, I think you've proven it to some degree, is what we need to do.
Yes.
To be able to keep the Italian-American alive and yet enter into what you have often called mainstream, dominant culture, whatever label we want to give it.
Because we really are a part of the mainstream, even though we're proud of our Italian heritage.
Exactly. Well, listen, I want to thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
My pleasure.
Living much of her adult life between the United States and Italy, her works, A Bridge Between the Two, expressing the experiences of women in both lands, in the past and in contemporary times, Helen Barolini is one of our community's most beloved authors. Her character speaking directly to descendants and immigrants and extending further, lauded by such peers as Alice Walker. Let's go to Hastings-on-Hudson with correspondent Lucia Grillo for an afternoon chat with author Helen Barolini.
Thank you for joining us on Italics.
Thank you for this occasion.
It's great to have you, especially for Women's History Month.
Yes.
In your vast body of work and in your advocacy of the works of others, you've done a lot through your own literature and what we'll call your proactive insistence that Italian-American women writers be heard.
Yes.
Your work has been widely recognized, lauded by the Italian-American community and by such as the New York Times Book Review and Alice Walker. Let's start with your story.
After college, I had a grant to study in England. And when I was in England, I knew that what I really wanted to do was to get to Italy. I didn't want to go back after the grant was over. So I started writing travel pieces for the newspaper in Syracuse, where I come from. And that took me to Italy. And once I got to Italy, I had a letter of introduction to a journalist who perhaps could help me find material. That journalist was Anthony Barolini. So he was helpful. And I was there for about a year. And then I came back home. But I missed Antonio, and we corresponded. And then finally, he tried to get the clearance to come over to the States, but there was such a law in that period, the McCarran law, that they thought if Antonio had been anti-fascist, which he was during the war, he was in hiding, he must be a communist. He had been editor of his paper in Vicenza and had written against the fascist regime. But anyway, he couldn't come, so I went back to Italy and lived there until he became a correspondent for La Stampa, the newspaper in Turin, and then we came to New York.
And you were translating his works.
Yes, and my first books were books of poetry. And then after that came the grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, from which I could start a full-length work, which was Umbertina.
Your groundbreaking anthology, The Dream Book, was the first anthology of Italian-American writers who are all women. We might assume, as with any other endeavor, that there were challenges.
Well, I felt very fortunate that Schocken really wanted to take it on because I thought it was a difficult subject to launch. I don't know how many in the wider public would be interested in just Italian-American women writers. But I felt that there were a number of us who hadn't been recognized, and we were present, and that if we were all brought together in one place, that gave us a distinction and a following.
In your original introduction of the same anthology, The Dream Book, in the section titled The Historical and Social Context of Silence, you began, I'm quoting, a question to ask rather than why Italian-American women were silent so long is what were the conditions that impeded the act of writing? Can you tell us about those conditions and how they changed for you personally and for others?
Well, I think Italian-American women, going way back to when they first got here, were workers. They had to work to survive here. And then there was family. And then it was the tradition itself. I mean, Italian tradition is very hard for women, I think, in some ways. They were thought to be the mothers, the caretakers, the family, the home. You know, there was a lot of that here among Italian Americans.
What are the conditions that impede writing now? Are they different from when you started? Or
Now, there's just much more competition. And there are fewer publishers, unfortunately. And also there's great emphasis on mass market. And I think that maybe our material seems too restricted.
Why do you think that Italian-American literature hasn't been accepted as American literature?
I think it just has to be taught and more disseminated, because I just don't think people are aware of it.
Have you ever thought of how it should be disseminated more?
Well, somebody's got to have a great bestseller like Mario Puzo did. And, that should have, in a way, opened up for the rest of us. But I don't think it did enough.
Yeah, like opened up the mafia genre,
Right,
unfortunately, because that's not all his work.
Because his Fortunate Pilgrim isn't that well known.
Right. And that would have, if that had been the book
Yes.
that made it,
Right.
things would have been different. Can you imagine the stories?
We all have
in
stories.
literature, film, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's come to Umbertina. What place does it hold for you within your own body of work?
Well, I always thought of it more as a feminist novel than an Italian-American novel, because the main protagonists are women, and they're women who achieve something. And I think that's what I was thinking of, because when it was written, it was in the times when the women's movement was very strong. And it was something that I very much believed in.
Do you consider Umbertina your best novel?
Oh, well, I'm sort of fond of all of them. It was very important for me. It was a real breakthrough to have that accepted and published.
In Umbertina, you talk about Marguerite's and perhaps all women's need to have their own identity. You say in the book, she had no official presence with which to impress people and help them recognize her, and yet she did. And then you go on to list details of her accomplishments and her losses and her hopes. This is a quote from the book. And still no one saw her. She could no more exist alone than does a painting without viewers or the Grand Canyon without tourists. Her existence depended on others. How could she get them to know, by Jesus, that she was here? This is reflective of your introduction to the most recent edition of the Dream Book, regarding the acknowledgement of Italian-American women writers, and it's a recurring theme. What does it mean on a societal level that marginalized people's voices be heard?
Well, we've had the feminist movement since then. I think things have come around, but there was a time when it was very hard for women to be perceived in their own right. They were always the accessory. They were the wife, the mother, and so on. But I think that has very much changed.
The grandmother is also a recurring consideration in your work. Again, from Umbertina, this is a quote. Marguerite wondered if her own fears were worse now than those faced by that Calabrian peasant, her grandmother. She says, I always fantasized about my grandmother. I always thought I wanted to get back to her elementary kind of existence, her kind of primitive strength. Do we carry this strength of the immigrant women with us?
I hope so. I hope so, in a different way, maybe, more modernized. But I think we have learned from the past. That's what we should do.
Do you carry it with you? I mean, you said that you've mentioned that you didn't really know your grandmother, but that image of her and this wanting to know who she was.
I think so. I think that's what led me to go off on my own, go to Europe, go to Italy, and do what I did. I see them as symbols, and I see them as reinforcing our own dreams to go ahead, and admire their strength and what they had to overcome.
Writing from the point of view of Italian-American experience, you say about Umbertina, what was her story? Who is she? And I knew all those years later that was the story I wanted to write. This unrecognized other. If these books are not published and available to a wide audience, then the actual people themselves become kind of invisible.
Exactly, yes. Well, because I always had this thought of my grandmother, with whom I could not communicate at all. And she was always this woman in the kitchen doing the cooking. And we were the family out in the other rooms, being very festive and everything. And I always thought, who is this woman in the kitchen? She's my grandmother, but who is she? I couldn't speak to her. All I could say was, "Come stai, Grandma?" And then she would pat me, you know, and bene, bene. But no, I had to create her. I had to create her for myself, really, because I wanted to know her story. She couldn't talk to me, and I couldn't talk to her, but I knew from where she came, so I studied a bit of the immigration from Calabria and the background of the people there. I went to Calabria.
To Castagna, where she was from?
Yes, yes. When I took that trip with my cousin, I found this.
And is this chestnut wood?
Oh, I don't know what it is, but it's Calabrian. I saw, you know, the hard life those people had. And I could understand why they came in droves to America. Umbertino was very pressing on me because I had lived in Italy. I had gone to where she came from. I had seen the environment and the people and all that, so that was natural to start from there. It was of its time. It was a time when we were getting back to roots, and so that was very powerful. We were all thinking, oh, well, what is roots in my life, you know, and we were getting back to that.
What were some of the challenges then, living in Italy and in that particular time?
Oh, I loved living in Italy. It was my golden age. In that circle, we knew all the writers, Montali, Calvino, and everybody, you know. Really, it was very inspiring.
What are your thoughts on how Italians view Italian Americans?
They seemed to think that it was the lower class, the ones who left, and that was good. Let them go. As a matter of fact, yes, I have often thought that in a way, I uplifted myself by marrying a real Italian who was already professionally known and was an accepted writer. If I had gone there just as myself, an Italian American, it would have been different, I think. And I am working now on my memoir.
Really looking forward to that. Thank you. Thanks
Thank
so much
you.
for joining us.
Italics joined artists and members of the New York community for Chalk, the first 10 years. Commemorating the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, the Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition hit the streets on March 25th to write the names of 146 workers, most of them young immigrant women and girls who were killed that fateful day in 1911.
Forthcoming events at the John D. Calandra Italian-American Institute. April 16th, Texan Italian Stories, directed by Sergio Carvajal Leoni, followed by a post-screening discussion with the director and producer, led by Rosangela Briscese of the Calandra Institute. April 24th through 26th, Mafias, Realities and Representations of Organized Crime. The Calandra Italian-American Research Institute's annual scholarly conference takes on the theme of mafias for the first time, covering a broad variety of manifestations of organized crime throughout the world and over time. New on Italics TV, Donna Chirico talks with Anthony Tamburri, Dean of the Calandra Institute, about his most recent publication, Rereading Italian Americana. Watch it at youtube.com/ItalicsTV.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Italics. Tune in to our next episode of Italics, airing April 30th. Watch previous editions of Italics on cuny.tv/show/Italics and web extras, including the full version of the interviews you just saw on our Italics YouTube channel, Italics TV. I'm Anthony Tamburri. Arrivederci alla prossima puntata. We'll leave you with Kairos Italy Theater's Tosca and the Two Downstairs, running through March 30th at the Capo Opera in Manhattan.